Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The number is on the screen. It arrived there sometime during the night, assembled by the device on the wrist, transmitted to the application, processed through the algorithm that converts the raw signals into the single value that is now displayed. The number is between 0 and 100. It represents, according to the device's documentation, the quality of the night's sleep. A high number suggests a night that the device's model considers restorative. A low number suggests a night the model considers insufficient. The number was not there when the night began. The device was on the wrist when the light went off. It was on the wrist through the hours of the night, pressing against the skin at the inner wrist. The sensors on its underside in contact with the skin throughout. The skin was in contact with the sensors for the full duration. The warmth of the wrist transferring into the device's housing. The device's weight distributed across the contact area. The small optical components pointing into the tissue throughout the hours. The device was recording. The number is what that recording produced. The number is not what it appears to be. Not false. Not a number that has no relationship to what happened in the body during the night. But not what it appears to be in the sense that a temperature reading appears to be. A direct measurement of a physical quantity. The instrument in contact with the thing being measured. The reading a direct translation of that contact into a number. The sleep score is not that kind of number. It is the output of a chain of inferences, each step in the chain converting one kind of signal into another, each conversion adding a layer of interpretation between the sensor and the thing the sensor is supposed to be measuring. The chain begins in the wrist. On the underside of the device, several small lights emit into the skin. They are green, typically, wavelengths in the range of 520 to 560 nanometers, chosen because blood absorbs green light more strongly than it absorbs other visible wavelengths. The light passes through the outer layers of the skin and into the tissue below, where it encounters capillaries, the small blood vessels that carry blood close to the surface. Some of the light is absorbed by the blood in these capillaries. Some is reflected back toward the surface. A sensor on the device detects the reflected fraction. The outer layers of the skin scatter some of the light before it reaches the capillaries. The tissue between the sensor and the capillaries is not uniform. It varies in thickness and composition from one point to the next across the contact area. The device averages across the area its sensor covers, receiving a signal that represents the aggregate of the light reaching back from all the capillaries beneath the contact zone. Different devices with different sensor sizes and positions on the wrist receive slightly different signals from the same wrist on the same night. The amount of light that is absorbed by the blood is not constant. When the heart contracts and pushes a pulse of blood into the capillaries, the concentration of blood in the tissue briefly increases. More blood means more absorption. The reflected fraction decreases. When the pulse passes and the capillaries return to their resting volume, the blood concentration decreases. The reflected fraction increases. This cycle, more blood, less reflection, less blood, more reflection, repeats with each heartbeat. The sensor detects it as a wave, a regular oscillation in the intensity of the reflected light. 1 cycle per heartbeat. The timing of these cycles is the pulse. The device extracts 2 things from this signal. The first is the heart rate, the number of cycles per minute. The second is more precise, the interval between each cycle and the next. Not the average interval, but each individual interval, measured to the nearest millisecond. The difference between one interval and the next. The variation in this difference over sequences of beats. This variation is called heart rate variability. The variation is not noise. It is the record of a nervous system adjusting beat by beat. 2 branches of the autonomic system in continuous dialogue, one pressing the rate upward, one pressing it down. The small difference in their timing producing the slight irregularity in the interval from one beat to the next. In a body at rest, the dialogue is nuanced, the variation present. When the system is under load, the dialogue becomes less nuanced. The intervals become more uniform. The variation decreases. The device monitors this variation through the night. During the hours of sleep, the variation follows a pattern that corresponds, on average, across many people, to the stages the body passes through. In deep sleep, the heart rate is low and the variation follows a particular signature. In the stage of sleep associated with vivid dreaming, the heart rate is higher and more variable, and the autonomic pattern is different. In light sleep, the pattern differs from both. The device's algorithm has been trained on data that includes both the optical sensor readings and the electrical measurements of sleep stages. The gold standard method that requires electrodes placed on the scalp from a large number of people sleeping in laboratory conditions. From this training, it has learned which optical sensor patterns tend to correspond to which sleep stages. It applies this learning to the current night. The optical sensor produces its wave. The algorithm examines the wave's current shape, rate, and variability. It compares what it sees to the patterns it learned from the training data. It assigns a probability. This pattern is more consistent with deep sleep than light sleep. This pattern is more consistent with waking than with either. The assignment is not a measurement of sleep stage. It is an estimate generated by a model trained on population-level data, applied to an individual night. The device's second sensor is an accelerometer. It detects the orientation and acceleration of the device, which is to say, of the wrist the device is on. In sleep, the body is mostly still. The wrist is mostly still. The accelerometer registers low acceleration, stable orientation, the small perturbations of the mattress's surface as the body breathes, no more. In waking, the body moves. The wrist moves. The accelerometer registers these changes as shifts in the force it detects along its measurement axis. The accelerometer does not know whether the body is asleep. It knows the current orientation and acceleration of the wrist. From this, the algorithm draws inferences. A wrist that is still and at a consistent orientation is a wrist that is probably not being used for deliberate movement. A wrist that is moving, changing orientation, producing the patterns of acceleration that arm movement creates, is a wrist that is probably in use. The algorithm interprets the first condition as consistent with sleep and the second as consistent with waking. The interpretation is usually correct. It is not always correct. A body can lie still while awake, lying in the dark, not moving, the wrist completely still, the accelerometer producing the signal that the algorithm associates with sleep, while the body is fully awake. A body can move during sleep, repositioning, the movement that REM sleep sometimes produces in the arms, the small adjustments that deep sleep does not eliminate entirely. In these cases, the accelerometer's signal conflicts with or complicates what the optical sensor is indicating, and the algorithm weighs the combined evidence. The algorithm uses this data alongside the optical sensor data. Movement suggests waking. Stillness, combined with the heart rate variability patterns associated with sleep, suggests sleep. Stillness combined with the patterns associated with waking, the slightly higher heart rate, the different variability signature, suggests a body that is lying still but not asleep. The algorithm weighs these signals against each other, integrates them over intervals of 30 seconds or a minute, and produces a stage classification for each interval. The night, which passed as a continuous experience, or as the absence of experience, is divided into segments. Each segment receives a label. These labels are aggregated into the score. The score reflects the proportion of the night the algorithm classified as each stage, weighted by the algorithm's assessment of how restorative each stage is, combined with the total duration, adjusted for the device manufacturer's model of what a night of a particular age and health profile should look like. The result is a number between 0 and 100. The number did not measure the night. It measured what the sensor could receive from it. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The number is a compression. It has taken the optical sensor's wave, the continuous oscillation of reflected green light from the capillaries in the wrist, varying many times per second across the duration of the night, and converted it to pulse intervals. It has taken the pulse intervals and converted them to a variability measure. It has taken the variability measure and compared it to patterns in a model. It has taken the model's output and compared it to the accelerometer's output. It has taken the combined estimate and divided the night into labeled segments. It has taken the labeled segments and aggregated them into a single value. At each conversion, some information was retained and some was not. The optical sensor wave contains more information than the pulse intervals extracted from it. The full wave shape, the details of how the reflected light rises and falls within each cycle. Information that the pulse interval extraction process does not carry forward. The pulse intervals contain more information than the variability measure computed from them. The exact value of each interval, the sequences of intervals across the night, the fine structure of the variability that the aggregate statistic compresses. The variability measure contains more information than the sleep stage classification derived from it. The variability is a continuous signal. The classification converts it to a discrete label, one of 4 or 5 categories, discarding the gradations within. Each step in the chain extracts the information the next step requires and discards the rest. What is on the screen is what survived this sequence of extractions. It is not a small amount. The number carries real information about the night, information that correlates across populations with outcomes that matter. But it is not the night. It is the residue of the night after it has been passed through the chain. The chain was designed to produce a useful residue. It does. What it cannot produce is what the chain discarded at each step. The light from the screen travels to the eye. The eye is dark adapted, or partially so. The room has been dark, and the eye has been moving toward its maximum sensitivity through the hours of sleep. The screen's output reaches the retina. The cells built to report the presence of blue-green light to the body's clock receive the screen's short wavelength output. The clock receives their report. Light is present. The chemistry shifts toward the waking state. The heart rate, which was at its sleeping level, low, regular, the variability running at the pattern the sleeping nervous system produces, begins to receive the signals appropriate to a body that is becoming more awake. It rises slowly, not the full acceleration of alarm. The gradual return to the waking rate at the speed the returning chemistry allows. Each beat slightly faster than the one before it, the intervals shortening, the variability pattern shifting from the sleeping signature toward the waking one. The breath, which was regular at the depth and rate of sleep, begins to shift. The postural muscles, which had been at the reduced tone of sleep, the release that the hours in the dark produced, begin to return toward waking tone. The eyelids hold the light of the screen. The hand that reached for the device is still holding it. The number on the screen is describing the past. The sensor on the wrist is measuring the present. The present includes the response to the number. The accelerometer registers the movement of the hand that reached for the device. The optical sensor is receiving data from the wrist of a body that is now partially awake. The heart rate beginning to rise from the sleeping level, the variability shifting from the sleeping pattern. The algorithm is classifying this interval. The classification will differ from the classification of the intervals that preceded it. Those intervals were still in sleep. This interval is the transition away from sleep, produced by the act of consulting the record of the sleep. The sensor does not know what the number said. It does not receive the interpretation. It receives the physiology. The physiology is changing because the number was read, and the sensor is recording the change, and the algorithm is classifying it, and the classification will eventually become part of the next score, which will arrive on the screen at the end of the next recording period as a number between 0 and 100. The measurement and the thing being measured are in contact. The instrument is now measuring the instrument's own effect on the night. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The device's sensors continue running. The optical sensor is still emitting light into the skin. The reflected fraction is still varying with each heartbeat. The accelerometer is still detecting the orientation and motion of the wrist. The algorithm is still processing both signals, still classifying each 30-second interval against the patterns in its model, still producing a running assessment of the body's current state. The number on the screen is a photograph, not a live feed, a photograph of a duration that has already ended. The hours between the point when the recording began and the point when the algorithm compiled its output. The night to which it refers has passed. The sleep it describes cannot be changed by reading it, cannot be improved by finding it insufficient, cannot be recovered by lying down again in the same night. The hours are behind. What the sensor is measuring now is a different state. The state produced by waking in this room at this hour, by reaching for this device, by looking at this number. The optical sensor is measuring the pulse intervals of a body that is now more awake than it was before the screen came on. The accelerometer is registering the movement of the hand that holds the device. The algorithm is classifying this current interval. The classification it arrives at for this interval will reflect what the sensors are receiving now, not the sleep state, but the post-sleep, post-screen state. This classification will become part of the record. The next number is already being assembled. The optical sensor is recording the pulse intervals of this hour. The accelerometer is recording the current level of movement. The algorithm is classifying the current state. In the hours of sleep that will come, later tonight or the following night, the sensor will continue its recording, and the algorithm will continue its classification. And when the next morning arrives, there will be another number on the screen, assembled from the data of the intervening hours. That number will also be a compression. It will also be the output of the chain, light to pulse to variability to classification to score. It will also describe what the sensor could receive from the night, not the night itself. It will arrive on the screen as a single value, carrying inside it the sequence of conversions that produced it, each conversion having retained what the next step required and discarded the rest. The chain does not pause between nights. On the wrist, the green light continues. The pulse changes beneath it. The interval will become part of the record. The record will become part of the next number. Breath enters. Breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The brain has not stopped. The body is in the bed. The room is dark. The body has been moving through the transition that sleep requires. Muscles releasing their waking tone. Hands warming as blood distributes toward the surface. Breathing settling into the rhythm that rest requires. The body is on its way. The brain is still running. Not at the rate it ran at noon, when the day was in full demand, when language was being produced and received, when decisions were being made, when the stream of incoming events was being processed against the accumulated record of what had come before. Not at that rate, but not dark, not off. The tissue is still consuming glucose. The neurons are still producing the coordinated activity that the current state requires. The blood supply to the brain continues at rates that, even in deep sleep, remain substantial. The brain never falls below a level of activity that requires continuous supply. What changes in the transition is not whether the brain is running. What changes is which parts are running, at what cost, and what they are doing. The transition is not uniform across the brain. The region at the front of the brain, the region behind the forehead, the prefrontal cortex, is the most metabolically expensive region the brain contains. This is a measurable fact. Imaging techniques that track glucose consumption across the brain's surface produce maps of which regions are using the most energy at any given moment, and in the waking brain engaged in the activities that waking involves: planning, language, the monitoring of one's own thinking, the evaluation of options, the suppression of responses that are possible but not appropriate. The prefrontal cortex consistently appears among the highest consumers. It is expensive to run. The blood supply to this region carries more glucose per unit of tissue than the blood supply to many other regions, because the region requires it. What this region does in waking is specific. It produces the capacity to hold a plan in mind while working through the steps required to execute it. It produces the capacity to evaluate a possible response and decline to make it. It produces the capacity to monitor what is being thought, not just to think, but to observe the thinking, to note where it is going, to redirect it. It produces the capacity to attend selectively, to keep some information in the foreground of processing, while other information waits. These capacities have costs. They require the sustained coordinated activity of many neurons, the maintenance of working representations across time, the continuous regulation of what is suppressed and what is allowed to run. In waking, these costs are paid continuously. In the transition to sleep, the cost begins to fall. The metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases. The glucose consumption in this region drops toward the levels that deep sleep will eventually produce. Not suddenly, not a single step from full activity to the sleeping level. A gradient. The region's activity moving across the period of the transition from the waking level toward the sleeping level. The reduction occurring at the rate that the neural chemistry of the transition allows. The neurons in this region are not all stopping at once. The network of connections between them, the specific patterns of activation that produce the capacity for directed attention and monitored thought, begins to run at lower coherence. The coordinated activity that the waking prefrontal cortex maintains, the sustained synchrony between connected regions that allows a complex task to be held in the foreground, becomes less sustained. The coherence fluctuates. The foreground dims at uneven rates across the network. This reduction is not the brain shutting down. It is the brain reassigning what it will spend its resources on. The activities that the prefrontal cortex supports, the monitoring, the planning, the selective attention, require the prefrontal cortex to be running at high activity. As its activity decreases, these capacities decrease with it. The ability to hold a complex thought in the foreground and work through it step by step becomes less available. The ability to redirect a thought that is going somewhere unhelpful becomes less available. The thoughts that were being evaluated and directed and suppressed are now less under the regulation that the prefrontal cortex provides. This is not a malfunction. It is the cost of the most expensive region withdrawing from the foreground. What remains is not silence. Other regions are still running. The regions responsible for processing sensory information, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the regions that process the signals arriving from the body, remain active at levels closer to their waking activity for longer in the transition. They are receiving less input because the body's sensory channels are providing less, and because the thalamus has begun to restrict what it forwards. But they are not off. The default mode network, the set of regions that becomes more active when the brain is not engaged in a specific external task, when the mind is wandering, when the processing turns towards self-referential thought and the construction of internal narratives, remains active through much of the transition. It does not withdraw as early as the prefrontal cortex. These regions do not require the same level of external input to run. They generate their own activity from the accumulated patterns of the past. In the early stages of the transition, as the directed, monitored, regulated activity of the waking prefrontal cortex diminishes, the default mode network may briefly become more prominent in the balance of the brain's overall activity. The thoughts that arrive in the transition, the unbidden images, the fragments, the sequences that do not follow from each other, are not noise generated by a brain that is shutting down. They are the residue of processing that is still running in a brain that is no longer being regulated by what was regulating it. The expensive regulation has withdrawn. What runs without it is still running. The pathway between the sensory organs and the cortex runs through the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay, a structure through which almost all sensory information passes on its way to the cortex. In waking, the thalamus forwards what it receives. The sound that arrives at the ear produces a signal. The signal reaches the thalamus. The thalamus forwards it to the auditory cortex. The auditory cortex processes it. The result contributes to what is heard. The thalamus is not passive in this relay. It performs some processing of its own, selects what to forward based on the current state of the system. But in waking, its primary mode is to forward. In the transition to sleep, the thalamus changes what it forwards. The change is not complete and not sudden. The thalamus begins to pass less of what it receives. The signals arriving from the sensory organs are reaching the thalamus at the same strength they were reaching it an hour ago. The room has not changed. The sounds have not changed. The small sensory input of the skin's contact with the bedding has not changed. What changes is how much of what arrives is forwarded upward. The thalamus reduces the relay. The cortex receives less of what the sensory organs are producing. The sounds that are still in the room reach the auditory cortex in reduced form, or do not complete the relay at all. The mechanical motion of the building, the ambient sounds of the street, the small adjustments the room makes at this hour. These signals are still arriving at the ear, still producing neural responses in the structures of the inner ear, still reaching the thalamus. At the thalamus, more of them stop. The relay that would carry them to the cortex and complete the processing that makes them events, identifiable sounds in specific locations, sounds that might require a response, is reduced. The room is present. Less of the room is reaching the cortex. The thalamus does not make this change because it has been instructed to. The chemistry of the transition, the building concentrations of the compounds that accumulate with sustained waking and promote sleep onset, changes the activity of the thalamic neurons, and the change in their activity changes what they forward. The relay is modulated by the same process that is modulating the rest of the transition. In the transition to sleep, the brain begins to produce a pattern it does not produce in waking. Brief bursts of coordinated neural activity, lasting half a second, perhaps a full second, appear in the recordings of the brain's electrical activity during light sleep. These bursts are organized, not the random fluctuations of noise, but a specific waveform, rising and falling at a consistent frequency in the range of 12 to 15 cycles per second. The pattern repeats through the night, more frequently in some stages than others, present through the hours of sleep but not present in waking. They arise from the same thalamic circuits that are changing what they forward. The thalamus is not simply reducing the relay. While it reduces the upward transmission of sensory signals, its neurons are producing a different kind of coordinated activity, a rhythmic pattern that the cortex receives and echoes, the two structures briefly locked into the oscillation that characterizes these bursts. The burst arrives at the cortex responds, the burst ends. The pattern does not continue into the next burst without a break. These are not silence. They are not the absence of activity. They are coordinated activity of a specific kind, activity that the waking brain does not produce, that appears as the transition from waking to sleep is completed and the early stages of sleep are running. The function of these bursts is not fully settled, but they appear to be involved in processing incoming sensory signals in a way that prevents them from producing full waking. A sound in the room arrives at the thalamus. The thalamus, instead of forwarding the signal upward in the way that would produce the full waking response, incorporates it into the spindle pattern. The signal is handled, but handled in the sleep mode rather than the waking mode. The brain is not asleep in the sense of having nothing to do. It is handling the incoming signals in a different mode. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The brain did not go dark. The most costly signals moved out of the foreground. What moved into the foreground's place is harder to observe than what was there before. The prefrontal cortex, when it was running at its waking level, produced activity that was visible in its effects, in the language it generated, the decisions it produced, the directed attention it maintained. Its activity was legible because it output into the world, into words, into actions, into the stream of conscious processing that waking experience is made of. What runs in the space the withdrawal produces does not output in the same way. The glial cells contracting and opening the interstitial space do not produce any experience that the brain reports. the fluid moving through the expanded spaces does not produce a sensation. The spindles that pass between the thalamus and the cortex are not perceived as events. The clearance running in the tissue is not visible to any monitoring that the brain does of itself. The waking brain does not know whether the clearance ran well or poorly, because the clearance runs below the level of the processing that would know. Under the expensive processing that has withdrawn, under the monitoring and the planning and the directed attention, the work that waking suspended is beginning. The cells that support and supply the neurons, the glial cells, which make up a substantial portion of the brain's total tissue and perform the maintenance functions that neurons cannot perform themselves, change their geometry during sleep. In waking, these cells are relatively compact, their volume occupying a high proportion of the space available in the tissue. In sleep, they reduce their volume, the cells themselves becoming slightly smaller, the space between them increasing. The expansion is not large in absolute terms, a fraction of the total volume of the tissue, but it is sufficient to change the rate at which fluid can move through the spaces. The fluid that circulates around and through the brain flows more freely into the expanded spaces. The cerebrospinal fluid, the clear fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord, produced continuously and reabsorbed continuously, moving through the spaces between the brain and the skull and into the tissue itself, enters the expanded interstitial spaces at a higher rate during sleep. It moves through the tissue in the direction of the concentration gradients that the tissue presents, carrying with it the compounds that have accumulated in the spaces between cells during the waking hours. The brain washes itself while the expensive processing is not running. This is not incidental. The metabolic activity that the waking brain requires produces waste compounds. The molecular residue of the energy production and signal transmission that sustain the waking state. These compounds accumulate in the spaces between cells. In waking, when the glial cells are less contracted and the interstitial space is smaller, the fluid exchange that would clear these compounds runs slowly. In sleep, when the spaces open and the fluid can move through them freely, the clearance rate increases substantially. The exchange runs under what was running before. The prefrontal cortex is at reduced activity. The thalamus is forwarding less. The spindles that waking does not produce are appearing, brief coordinated bursts running between the thalamus and the cortex at the rate the current stage of sleep produces, more frequent now than in the early transition, less frequent than in the deeper stages that will come later in the night. The glial cells have reduced their volume. The space between them has increased from the waking level toward the sleeping level. The fluid is moving through the tissue at the rate the expanded space allows, carrying toward the circulation what the day deposited there. The metabolic residue of the waking hours, the compounds that accumulated in the interstitial space while the prefrontal cortex was running at its waking cost, and the glial cells were at their waking geometry. The brain at this hour is not the brain that was running an hour ago. It is running a different set of processes at a different cost. The expensive foreground quiet, the maintenance that could not run, While the expensive foreground was now running in the space the withdrawal produced. The brain is not empty in that space. It is occupied with what the space allows. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The room holds what the night produces. The body has crossed most of the thresholds that the transition required. The brain is in the early stages of the sleep state. The activity reorganized, the costly foreground withdrawn, the processes that require low metabolic activity now running in the low activity state, the withdrawal allowed. The room that is dark and quiet is receiving a brain that has reorganized toward this darkness, matching its state to what the room is offering. The foreground is not gone. It will return. In the hours of the night, the brain will pass through cycles, periods of deep sleep in which the expensive processing is at its minimum, and periods of high activity in which the brain runs at levels approaching the waking state, producing the coordinated neural activity that vivid dreaming requires. The foreground will return in those periods at a different kind of cost for a different kind of work. For now, it has withdrawn. In the space the withdrawal produced, the fluid continues to move. The glial cells continue to hold the expanded geometry that the sleep state allows. The fluid continues to carry through the spaces between the cells what the day's activity deposited there. The most costly signals are out of the foreground. Underneath them, the exchange continues. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. At 4 a.m., the city is not dark. It is never fully dark. The streetlights below run through the night and into the early hours, producing the amber and white that reflects off the wet pavement and rises toward the windows of the buildings above. The pavement is wet because the rain has been falling for some time, and the surface water has not yet had the opportunity to drain or evaporate. It lies in a thin sheet on the asphalt, and the streetlights reflect from this sheet at a low angle, extending each lamp's illumination downward and outward across the surface of the street. The storefronts are closed, but their signs remain on. The small persistent light of the vending machine on the corner, the blue-white fluorescence leaking from the convenience store on the far side of the intersection, the red signals cycling at empty intersections with no one to wait for them. The city at 4 a.m. is a different light from the city at noon. But it is not dark. The rain is on the window, not rain falling past the window. Rain that has reached the glass and is staying there, accumulated on the outer surface, the drops that arrived in the past minutes still present. Some have merged with others, some are moving, some have stopped partway down the glass and are held in a fixed position by the balance of forces acting on them. Some are very small, barely visible, present as a general haziness at the level of the glass surface, rather than as individual drops. Together they produce the condition of a window that is wet on the outside, and the wet outer surface changes everything the window does with the light from the city below. The room behind the glass is dark and still. A raindrop arriving at glass does not arrive as a sphere. A falling raindrop takes a shape in the air, roughly spherical for small drops, slightly flattened at the bottom by air resistance for larger ones. When it reaches the glass, the impact changes everything. The leading edge of the drop contacts the glass surface at high velocity relative to its size, and the surface tension that held the spherical shape is not sufficient to resist the force of the impact. The drop spreads outward from the point of contact, the water flowing in a ring around the impact point, the film spreading thin at the edges. What the spread produces is a disc, not a perfect disc. The impact is rarely perfectly centered. The surface of the glass is not perfectly smooth at the scale the drop encounters. The air currents at the moment of arrival shift the trajectory slightly, but roughly a disc, a thin film of water spread across an area many times larger than the cross-section of the falling drop. The water held at the glass surface by the same forces that determine the contact angle at impact. The contact angle is the angle at which the water surface meets the glass surface at the edge of the drop. A very low contact angle means the water spreads flat, forming a thin sheet across the glass. A very high contact angle means the water forms a tight bead, touching the glass at only a small area. The glass of a window that has been exposed to the air has accumulated a thin film of organic molecules, compounds released by the city's air, the fine emissions of traffic and cooking and the biological processes of the city that settle onto every exposed surface. This film makes the glass slightly less wettable than clean glass, and the contact angle the rain encounters on this surface is in the range that produces drops that bead moderately. Not flat sheets, not tight beads, but the rounded forms that hold their shape on the glass while remaining large enough to see. The drops that are still on the glass are not at rest. Gravity is pulling them downward. Surface tension is resisting. At the bottom edge of each drop, the water is trying to advance down the glass surface, and the contact angle at that advancing edge resists the advance. At the top of the drop, the contact angle at the receding edge allows the drop to pull away from the glass surface it has already wet. The drop moves when the gravitational force on its mass exceeds the force required to advance the contact line at the bottom and retreat the contact line at the top. A larger drop moves sooner. A smaller drop can hold its position longer. The drops that are moving leave a trace. As a drop moves down the glass surface, it passes over the film of molecules that was there before it. Some of those molecules dissolve into the moving drop. Some of the water from the drop is left behind at the glass surface as the drop passes. A thin layer, thinner than the drop itself, following the path the drop took. This residual layer changes the contact angle for the next drop that encounters it. The glass surface in the path of a previous drop is slightly more wettable than the glass surface that has not been wet recently. The drops that follow tend to follow the paths of the drops that preceded them. Not exactly. Each new drop arrives at a slightly different position. The surface conditions are not identical. The balance of forces at the edge of each drop is different in detail. But the tendency is present. The paths of previous drops guide the paths of subsequent drops, and over the duration of a rain, the glass develops a pattern of channels, lines of higher wettability running down the surface, the accumulated record of every drop that has traced that path before. The pattern on the glass is the rain's history, written in surface chemistry. The streetlights outside reach the glass through the rain. The light travels from the lamp, through the air, through the falling rain. Some of it scattered by the falling drops, some of it reaching the glass directly. At the glass surface, the light encounters the drops in the film. Where a drop sits on the glass, the water forms a curved surface, a lens with a focal length determined by the radius of curvature of the drop surface. Light passing through this lens is bent. The bending concentrates some of the light into a focal region behind the drop and disperses other portions of the light away from the direct path. Each drop on the glass is a small optical element. The city lights, viewed through a glass covered in these elements, are not seen as points or as the distributed illumination they are. They are seen as the sum of the contributions of many small lenses and films, each bending, focusing, and scattering the incoming light in a slightly different direction. A single street lamp appears as a diffuse glow with concentrated bright regions where the drop's focal points fall toward the eye. The specific pattern depends on the distribution of drops on the glass at this moment, which drops are present, where they sit, how large they are, how far they have moved since arriving. The distribution changes as drops move and new ones arrive and others merge. Two people standing at this window at two different moments would see two different patterns of the same city lights, because the drops on the glass at each moment are in a different configuration. The city that is visible through the rain-covered glass is not the city. It is the city as the glass is currently rendering it. The rain outside became a pattern only when the glass received it. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. On the inner surface of the glass, the conditions are different. The outer surface is in contact with the rain-cooled air of the city. The inner surface is in contact with the air of the room. Air that is slightly warmer than the outside, the warmth that the sleeping body has been releasing since the room was closed. Between the outer surface and the inner surface, the glass carries a temperature gradient, cooler at the outside face, slightly warmer at the inside face, the transition running through the glass's thickness. If the temperature of the inner glass surface falls below the temperature at which the room's air can no longer hold all its moisture in vapor form, moisture from the room's air will condense onto the inner surface. This is the same process that produces condensation on any cold surface in a humid room. The temperature differential providing the condition, the surface providing the place where the transition from vapor to liquid can begin. The condensation that forms on the inner surface is different in character from the rain on the outer surface. The rain arrives as discrete drops with kinetic energy, spreading and beading and running under gravity and surface tension. The condensation on the inner surface arrives molecule by molecule without impact, accreting gradually from the room's air onto the surface, where the conditions for condensation are met. It builds slowly. It does not run, or runs only when the film has accumulated to the point where the weight of the water exceeds the surface tension, holding it to the glass. The inner surface, where condensation has formed, carries a film. Not drops in the sense the outer surface carries drops. A thin, continuous film, or a pattern of very small droplets, depending on how the condensation has nucleated across the surface. Where the glass surface has small irregularities, the first molecules to condense find a preferred site. More molecules accrete there. A tiny droplet forms. Around it, the immediate surface is slightly depleted of the water molecules the first droplet recruited. The distribution of condensation across the inner surface is a map of the surface's microscale geometry, where the irregularities were, where the first condensation nuclei formed. The glass between these two surfaces is a few millimeters thick. It transmits approximately 90% of the visible light that reaches it, reflecting the remaining fraction from each of its two surfaces. On a dry night, both surfaces are effectively transparent. The reflections are present but not visible as such, the light passing through with so little distortion that the glass seems not to be there. On a wet night, the outer surface is no longer transparent in the same sense. It is a surface with structure, drops, channels, a film of varied thickness. The light does not pass through unchanged. The city at 4 a.m. is visible through this structure. The amber of the street lights comes through as diffuse halos. The specific lights of the convenience store, the vending machine, the traffic signal, each arrives at the inner surface, having passed through the particular configuration of drops and channels that the outer surface carries at this moment. The configuration will be different in 10 minutes, different again in an hour. Each moment of the rain produces a different configuration, and the light that the inner surface delivers to the room at each moment is the light from the city as mediated by the current configuration. The sound of the rain arrives through the glass, or around it, through the gaps in the window frame, through the thin walls, through the structure of the building that connects every surface to every other surface, through the contact of its materials. The sound of individual drops striking the glass arrives first and most directly. Each drop's impact produces a brief, sharp vibration in the glass, a sound in the frequency range between 200 and 5,000 Hz, attenuated by the mass of the glass and the acoustic properties of the room beyond it. The drops striking the glass are discrete events. Each has its individual pitch and duration, determined by the size of the drop, the position of impact on the glass, the thickness of the glass at that point, the current state of the glass surface. A large drop striking a bare area of glass produces a lower, more resonant impact than a small drop striking a surface already covered in a thin film. The film changes the acoustic properties of the surface, dampening the sharpest frequencies, extending the duration of the impact slightly, softening the character of the sound. In aggregate, many drops striking many positions over many seconds produce a sound that is perceived not as a sequence of discrete events, but as a continuous texture. The ambient sound of rain on glass, the sum of the individual impacts averaged by the limitations of the ear's temporal resolution. The rate of arrival is higher than the rate at which the auditory system can distinguish individual events. The sound is not continuous. It is discrete events at a rate that exceeds the resolution of the system receiving it. What the room holds is the impression of continuity built from discrete arrivals. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. At the lowest part of the window, where the glass is coldest and the condensation on the inner surface is heaviest, the moisture has accumulated to the point where it has begun to run. Very slowly, not the running of a drop on the outer surface, driven by the weight of rain. The film on the inner surface is thin, and the contact angle is low. The glass that has been in contact with the room's air for a long time is more wettable than the outer surface. Thin films move slowly and under a smaller gravitational force than drops. The accumulation of moisture at the lower edge of the condensation zone runs at a rate that is visible only if the glass is watched for several minutes. The path it takes follows the path the previous condensation took. The glass at the lower edge of the window carries the record of many nights of condensation. The subtle variation in the wettability of the surface, the small scratches and irregularities that have guided moisture toward specific paths over the time the glass has been in this position. The moisture that is moving now is following a path that was established before this night. The drops on the outer surface are still moving. The channels they have traced into the molecular layer of the glass are guiding the drops that follow. Each drop that moves takes a path that is partly the path of the drops before it. Not exactly, because each drop's starting position and size differ, and the surface conditions shift as drops move through and past each other. But the tendency is there. The surface remembers in its wettability pattern what has crossed it. The inner surface carries its film, gathering what the room's air is releasing at the temperature differential that the rain outside and the sleeping body inside have established between them. The film is still accumulating where the surface is cold enough to receive it, and running very slowly at the lowest edge of the condensation zone, where enough has gathered to move. The city lights outside are arriving at the outer surface at this moment, being redirected by the drop's curved surfaces toward the inner surface, passing through two thicknesses of glass and two surfaces of water, and entering the room as the diffuse illumination that reaches the wall opposite the window. The level of illumination is too low to see. The physical fact is present. Photons from the city's lamps have traveled through the rain to the glass, through the glass to the room, and are arriving at the surfaces of the room right now at levels the eye cannot resolve in this darkness. The rain is outside. The pattern is on the glass. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The scribes have left. The candles were extinguished when the light failed, each flame pinched between dampened fingers or covered with a snuffer that pressed the cone of metal down over the wick until the oxygen was gone. The small sounds of the room, the scratch of quill on vellum, the occasional soft cough, the movement of a bench against the stone floor, ended with the last person's departure. The door was closed. The bolts were drawn. The room is not empty. The pages that were worked on today are still here. The quills that cut the letters are still here, set down on the slanted surfaces of the writing desks at the angle the last gesture of the hand left them. The inkhorns are still here, the iron gall ink inside them continuing its chemistry in the dark. The lamps that burn through the working hours have left their soot on the ceiling and the upper walls. The room holds what the day's work left behind, and the night's conditions are acting on all of it. The work the scribes finished today is not finished. The room is not empty, and it is not at rest. The chemistry is running at the rate the dark and cold require of it, which is slower than the rate the warmth of the working day provided, but not zero. Nothing has stopped. The pages are vellum, not paper. The word is important. Vellum is skin. It was made from the hide of a calf or a sheep or a goat, the animal slaughtered, the skin removed and cleaned and stretched on a frame while still wet, scraped thin with a curved blade as it dried under tension, the drying and the scraping working together to produce a surface that is fine-grained, translucent at its thinnest, strong enough to be folded without tearing, smooth enough to receive the fine strokes of a quill. The process removed the hair and the outer layers of the skin. What remained was the deep dermal layer, the collagen fibers that form the structural matrix of skin, reoriented and compacted by the stretching and scraping into a dense, interlocked material. The production of a single sheet of vellum consumed most of a day. The stretching had to be calibrated. Too much tension, and the skin would tear when it dried and contracted. Too little, and the resulting surface would be uneven, prone to rippling. The scraping had to be done at the right stage of drying. Too early, and the blade would tear rather than smooth. Too late, and the material had already set in whatever irregularities the drying had produced. The person doing the scraping was reading the surface as they worked, adjusting the angle and pressure of the blade to what the material was doing at that moment. The grain of the animal is still present in the vellum. Where the hair follicles were, the surface is slightly different. Small depressions in the regular pattern of the skin, sometimes visible to the eye as a faint stippling in the surface, sometimes detectable by the way the ink sits in those areas differently from the rest. The scribe who worked this page knew where the surface would be reliable and where it might resist the ink or hold it differently. The vellum carries this knowledge in its surface without having been asked to. The vellum is responding to the room. The room's air at night in a stone building is different from the room's air during the working day. When the scribes were present and the candles were burning, the room was warmer. The breath of the workers, the slight heat of the flames, the warmth of the bodies moving through the cold space. With the scribes gone and the candles out, the room has been cooling since the last person left. The stone walls and floor, which have been absorbing the heat of the working day, are now giving it back. But the process is slow, and the room is moving toward the temperature of the unheated stone, which is the temperature of the earth the building sits on. The vellum is hygroscopic. The collagen fibers that make up the vellum structure absorb and release moisture depending on the moisture content of the surrounding air. In humid air, the fibers take up water and swell slightly. In dry air, they release water and contract. This is not a gentle process in the sense of being without consequence. The swelling and contraction are not uniform across the page, because the skin was not uniform when the animal wore it. Areas that were denser, that had more follicles, that were closer to the spine or the belly or the leg, respond at slightly different rates and with slightly different magnitudes. The page that was flat when the scribes left is not perfectly flat now. The tension runs through the fibers, different in different regions of the page. The differential response to the night's humidity, producing small variations in the plane of the surface that the night air will modulate until the room's conditions and the vellum's current state reach an equilibrium. By morning, when the scribes return and begin to warm the room again, the page will respond to that change too. The humidity rising with the presence of the workers, the fibers taking up moisture again, the tensions shifting in the other direction. The tension is in the fibers. The ink on the page is not at rest. The ink that the scribes used was made from oak galls, the hard round growths that appear on oak trees where certain wasps have laid their eggs. The gall forming around the larva as it develops inside the tree. The galls were collected and ground and soaked in water or vinegar, and the resulting liquid was combined with ferrous sulfate, iron sulfate, obtained by the weathering of iron-bearing rock in regions where such rock was available, traded across distances for its utility in ink making, and with gum arabic, the dried sap of acacia trees, which acts as a binder to hold the ink's components in suspension and help them adhere to the writing surface. When this ink is first applied to the page, it appears brown. The iron in the ferrous sulfate has not yet fully oxidized. Over the hours and days and years after application, the iron oxidizes, ferrous iron converting to ferric iron, the compound darkening as the oxidation proceeds. The letters written this afternoon were brown when the scribe finished them. By morning, they will be slightly darker. Over decades, they will become the deep brown or black that old manuscripts carry. The oxidation does not stop when the scribe leaves. It does not require light or warmth to proceed. In the dark scriptorium, in the cooling room, the iron in the ink continues the conversion. It began the moment the ink was exposed to the air of the page. The letters are still being written by the chemistry the scribe initiated. The page was not preserving thought. It was holding pigment inside a prepared surface. The gum arabic in the ink is also changing. The polysaccharide chains that give gum arabic its binding properties are subject to hydrolysis, the breaking of the long chains by reaction with water. The process is slow at room temperature, very slow, requiring years to produce measurable change. But it is ongoing. The gum arabic that was mixed into the ink was already centuries old in the making. The acacia trees had laid it down over seasons. It had dried and been collected and transported and ground and dissolved. And it will continue to change in the centuries after the manuscript is made. The binding agent that holds the ink's particles to the vellum surface is slowly losing its length, slowly losing the viscosity and adhesion that it currently provides. Not tonight, not measurably tonight, but the process running tonight is the same process that will, given enough time, allow the ink to lift from the page in flakes, to powder where it was once smooth, to eventually release what the scribe deposited there back into the environment that surrounds the page. The ink on this page is in the early stages of a process that has no end, except the dispersal of what the scribe put together. The text that was completed today is still being worked on by the materials. The quill on the desk is drying. It was cut from the primary feather of a goose, the large flight feathers, which produce the stiff, curved shaft that gives the quill its structural integrity and the springiness that makes it responsive to the varying pressure of the scribal hand. The calamus, the hollow cylindrical base of the shaft, was cleaned and shaped, the outer membrane stripped away, the shaft sometimes hardened by curing in hot sand before the final cutting, the tip cut at an angle to a fine point, and split at the very tip to produce the small gap that draws ink by capillary action and deposits it with each stroke. The split at the tip is the part that wears first. The slight springiness of the split edges allows them to come together and separate as the scribe varies the pressure on the stroke. This motion wears the edges, each stroke compressing and releasing the split, the keratin of the tip abrading against the vellum surface. A well-cut quill holds its edge for a day of careful work, sometimes longer. By the end of the day's session, the scribes had cut new tips or replaced the worn quills with fresh ones. The quill that remains has been cut and used. The moisture that was in the shaft when the quill was in use, the small amount of residual moisture in the keratin, the moisture that the ink carried to the shaft with each dip, is leaving now. The shaft is contracting slightly as it dries, the curve that the feather's original growth gave, it becoming more pronounced as the material loses the moisture that had softened it slightly during use. By morning, the quill will be slightly more curved than it was when work ended. The soot on the ceiling is the record of every lamp that has burned in this room. Each lamp added a layer, not a thick layer, not a layer visible from any single night's burning, but a contribution to the accumulation that the years of lamp use have produced. The lamps in the Scriptorium burned oil or tallow, animal fat rendered into the form that would feed a flame, the flame converting the fat's carbon-hydrogen bonds into carbon dioxide and water vapor, with the fraction of the carbon that did not complete the conversion leaving as soot. The soot is particulate carbon, the solid residue of incomplete combustion, each particle a fraction of a micrometer in diameter, small enough to remain suspended in the air for minutes before settling. The air currents from the burning lamps carried the particles upward. The heat of the flame produced a column of rising air above it, and the soot particles that did not immediately adhere to nearby surfaces were carried up in this column toward the ceiling, where the current spread outward and slowed. As the current slowed, the particles settled from it, landing where the air could no longer carry them, accumulating on the stone ceiling and the upper surfaces of the walls in the thin layer that each year of burning produced. The ceiling is the archive of the light that was used here, not the content of the work, not the words, not the illuminations, not the decisions the scribes made about which passages to copy. The fact of the burning, the fact that people sat here in this room with lamps for hours across years. The soot does not know this. It settled because the air currents required it to. The record it constitutes was not intended by anyone. It is present in the material because the material could not help receiving what the burning sent toward it. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The stone of the walls is releasing the heat of the day. The walls absorbed what the candle flames and the bodies of the scribes provided during the working hours. Not a large amount. The room was cold during the day and colder now, but more than the stone held before the workday began. The thermal mass of a stone wall is considerable. A wall several feet thick can absorb heat slowly through the morning and release it slowly through the night. The temperature at the wall surface, lagging hours behind the temperature of the air adjacent to it. The heat conducts outward from the interior of the wall toward the outer surface, which is in contact with the cold night air outside the building, and inward toward the room, warming the air fractionally above what the stone held before the scribes arrived. The room is cooler now than it was at midday, warmer than the stone was before the scribes arrived. The difference is small, a fraction of a degree that no instrument kept in this building could measure, but the vellum is responding to it. The collagen fibers in the pages, which are contracting as the air cools and dries, are contracting at a rate that reflects the current temperature, not the temperature of an hour ago. The rate of the ink's oxidation is slightly lower at this temperature than it was at the warmer temperature of the working day. The rate will slow further as the room cools toward its minimum before dawn. The chemical work on the page runs at the rate the temperature provides. In the Scriptorium, the pages hold what the night is making of them. The ink that was brown this afternoon is slightly darker now. The oxidation that began the moment the quill lifted from the page has been running for the hours since. The iron in the ink moving from one state toward another, at the rate the room's temperature and moisture content allow. By morning, the increment will be small. Over decades, the ink will be unrecognizable as the brown it was today. What the scribe wrote in a particular brown is already something else. The vellum that was flat under the scribe's hand is carrying the tension of the night's humidity in its fibers. The collagen responding to the air that the stone room produces after dark, the page adjusting to the conditions it is in, rather than the conditions the scribes provided. The page does not know it was written on today. it responds to the air. The quill on the desk has contracted toward the curve the goose's feather originally had. The soot on the ceiling is the same soot that was there this morning, undisturbed, the record of the accumulated burning unaltered by the night. The work that was completed today has not stopped. The scribes are not here to see what is happening to it. The room is dark and sealed. No one is observing the oxidation or the contraction of the vellum or the slow drying of the quill. The processes do not require observation. They proceed at the rate the current conditions require, the temperature, the humidity, the chemistry of the materials in their current states, without any direction, without any awareness that they are being done. The page is still being made. The hands that made it are elsewhere. The stone holds the heat it has not yet given to the cold air. The ink holds the color it has not yet become. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The baths are closed. The last bathers departed hours ago. The sound of their voices gone. The sound of water settling after use gone. The attendants who carried fresh linen and scraped oil from skin with the curved blade gone. The furnaces that ran beneath the floors were banked down before the closing. The worker whose work was to feed them through the bathing day, now sleeping elsewhere in the building. The outer doors are bolted. The colonnades that surround the changing rooms are empty. The building that was full of people from morning until the last hour of light is now full of the materials those people left their warmth in. The building is still warm, not everywhere. The outer walls, which face the night air directly, have been releasing their heat to the outside since the sun began to fall, and the stone of the outermost surfaces has cooled toward the temperature of the night air. But the interior, the room of the warm pool, the room of the hot pool, the corridors that run between them, is warmer than the night outside. Walking through the interior at this hour, a person would feel the difference immediately. The air of the exterior passage is the temperature of the night, and the air of the interior rooms is warmer, the difference fading toward the outer walls and concentrating toward the pools and the floors above the furnace passages. The warmth is not from the furnaces which are banked or out. It is from the stone. The stone is still releasing what the furnaces put into it. The scraping working together to produce a surface that is fine-grained, translucent at its thinnest, strong enough to be folded without tearing, smooth enough to receive the fine strokes of a quill. The process removed the hair and the outer layers of the skin. What remained was the deep dermal layer, the collagen fibers that form the structural matrix of skin, reoriented and compacted by the stretching and scraping into a dense, interlocked material. The production of a single sheet of vellum consumed most of a day. The stretching had to be calibrated. Too much tension, and the skin would tear when it dried and contracted. Too little and the resulting surface would be uneven, prone to rippling. The scraping had to be done at the right stage of drying. Too early and the blade would tear rather than smooth. Too late and the material had already set in whatever irregularities the drying had produced. The person doing the scraping was reading the surface as they worked, adjusting the angle and pressure of the blade to what the material was doing at that moment. The grain of the animal is still present in the vellum. Where the hair follicles were, the surface is slightly different. Small depressions in the regular pattern of the skin, sometimes visible to the eye as a faint stippling in the surface, sometimes detectable by the way the ink sits in those areas differently from the rest. The scribe who worked this page knew where the surface would be reliable and where it might resist the ink or hold it differently. The vellum carries this knowledge in its surface without having been asked to. The floor of the warm room sits above a space. The construction required it. Beneath the tile surface the bathers walked on. The floor is raised on small columns of fired brick, each column standing on the foundation and supporting the weight of the floor above it, with a gap between the columns through which the hot gases from the furnaces could circulate. The hot gases entered from the furnace mouth at one end of the building, moved through the space beneath the floor, gave up their heat to the stone and tile above, and exited through flues built into the walls. The system ran for the hours of the bathing day. The tiles above it absorbed what the gases delivered. The tiles are a few centimeters thick, fired clay, dense, with the high heat capacity of ceramic materials, the capacity to absorb thermal energy and hold it while the temperature of the surrounding air changes. Through the hours of the bathing day, as the hot gases circulated below and the feet of the bathers walked above, the tile took in heat from both directions, from the gases conducting through the floor and from the bodies in contact with its surface. By the time the furnaces were banked, the tile had accumulated the thermal energy of the day's operation. Beneath the tile, the brick columns of the hypocaust have also absorbed heat. The columns that hold up the floor, the small towers of fired brick set on the foundation at regular intervals, have been surrounded by the hot gases for hours. Their surfaces absorbed what the gases delivered, and the interior of each column has been slowly warming from the outside in, the thermal front moving through the brick at the rate brick conducts heat. By midnight, the interior of the columns is warmer than it was at midday. In the hours since the furnaces were banked, the tile above is beginning to cool, and the columns below are still at nearly their maximum temperature. The furnaces are banked or out. The tile is still at the temperature that hours of heating produced. It has been releasing that temperature since the furnace output stopped, conducting heat upward into the room's air, conducting heat downward into the brickwork of the columns and the foundation below. The release is slow because the material has high thermal mass. What was put in over hours will not be fully released over minutes. The floor is still warm underfoot. The water in the warm pool has not reached the temperature of the air. the pool is deep enough, a meter or more of water, the surface area much smaller than the volume, that the rate of heat loss from the surface is slow, relative to the total heat stored in the body of water. Water has a very high specific heat. It takes more energy to raise the temperature of a given mass of water by 1 degree than it takes to raise the temperature of the same mass of stone by 1 degree. This same property means that water releases its heat more slowly when the surrounding conditions call for it to cool. The water that was heated by the furnaces operating through the bathing day is holding that heat against the night in a way that stone cannot. The water is warmer than the air of the room, not dramatically so. The room is itself still above the outside temperature, insulated by the thermal mass of the walls, warmed by the floor's continued release. But the water is warmer than the air, and the air is warmer than the outside, and the outside is the temperature of a night in the season this city is currently in. These three conditions, water, interior air, outside air, are at different temperatures, and the distances between them are diminishing as the night proceeds. By dawn, if the furnaces are not lit, the water will have moved closer to the air temperature, and the air will have moved closer to the outside temperature. The night is doing this slowly. At the surface of the water, exchange continues. Water molecules leave the surface and enter the air above the pool. The rate of evaporation depends on the water temperature and the moisture content of the air directly above the surface. The interior air is warm enough to have held moisture through the bathing day. The steam of the hot pool, the water from the bathers' bodies, the dripping from the walls and the ceiling. Now the air is cooling toward the wall's temperature, and some of what it holds in vapor form is being released onto the surfaces it contacts. The walls are wet. The upper surfaces of the interior walls, the plastered stone that runs from the height of a tall person to the ceiling, are receiving moisture from the air. Where the wall is cool enough that the air in contact with it cannot hold all the moisture it carries, that moisture is condensing onto the wall's surface. The condensation runs down the plaster in thin rivulets, following the small variations in the surface. A crack, a line where two sections of plaster meet, a place where the stone behind the plaster has a different thermal conductivity and is slightly cooler than its neighbors. The paths the water takes down the wall have been established by many nights of condensation before this one. The slight differences in the plaster's surface, the places where the mortar between the stone blocks creates a thermal bridge, the places where repairs have made the plaster slightly thicker, the places where the stone itself is denser and conducts heat differently, have produced consistent differences in the surface temperature. The condensation appears first where the wall is coldest and runs along the paths where the previous night's condensation softened the plaster's surface slightly, made the material more receptive, established the root. The wall tonight is running the roots that the wall has always run, because the conditions that establish those roots have not changed. The water that runs down the wall is the warmth of the pool, made visible at the cold surface. The pool is giving its heat to the air as evaporation. The air is giving the moisture to the wall as condensation. The wall is conducting the heat into the stone and out through the exterior, where the night receives it. The warmth that the furnaces put into the water this morning is on its way out of the building. It is at the wall now, crossing from the interior to the exterior, and the condensation is the sign of this crossing. Water marking the place where the warm interior and the cool wall meet. On the benches along the wall, the scrapers and oil flasks were left when the bathers departed. The scrapers are bronze, curved blades used to remove oil and sweat from the skin after exercise, a tool that the bathers used on themselves or had the bath attendants use on them at the end of the exercise period. The bronze was warm when the baths were active. The warmth of the hands that held it, the warmth of the room, the warmth of the skin it was pressed against. It absorbed what the room and the hands provided, and since the last bather set it down, it has been releasing this warmth to the air around it. Bronze has a lower specific heat than the stone of the walls and floor. It holds less thermal energy per unit mass, and it releases what it holds more quickly when the surrounding conditions are cooler than the material. A bronze scraper in this room at midnight has already equilibrated with the air. It has released what it held and is now at the temperature of the air around it. The floor beneath it is still warmer than the air. The scraper on the floor is at the air's temperature, not the floor's. The same room holds these two temperatures simultaneously. The floor releasing slowly over the course of the whole night, the tile and the brick of the hypocaust columns giving up the heat they have held against the cooling air. The bronze already at the room's air temperature, its contribution complete. The water in the pool somewhere between the two, cooler than when the furnaces were running, warmer than it will be by dawn. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The bath was not warm because the fire remained. It was warm because the stone had not finished releasing it. The stone of the walls records more than tonight. Where the plaster has been damaged or worn away, the stone beneath shows the accumulation of years, a thin layer of mineral deposit on the surfaces that were regularly in contact with the warm mineral-rich water and steam. The water that filled these baths was not pure. It carried dissolved minerals from the source, calcium carbonate and magnesium compounds and iron compounds in small concentrations. When the water evaporated or splashed against the walls and ran down and evaporated at the surface, the minerals stayed. They crystallized from the water as it concentrated, nucleating on the stone surface at the places where the water was thinnest, building the thin layer that has now accumulated on the interior stone face. The deposit is thin, a fraction of a millimeter in most places, thicker where the water was most consistently present, where the splash from bathers reached regularly, where the steam condensed most often. The deposit is not a record that can be read as a sequence. There is no legible stratification by year, no layer that corresponds to a particular season. The years of accumulation have produced a single surface layer, the sum of the deposits unable to be distinguished one from another in the material that remains. The layer is the record of the accumulated use of this space, held in the mineral that the water left behind. It is also the accumulated record of every evaporation, every moment when the water was warmer than the air above it, every moment when the mineral-bearing water dried on the stone surface and left the mineral behind. The warmth that drove those evaporations is the warmth that the furnaces provided. The furnaces ran because people came to bathe. The people have not come since this afternoon. The minerals that their bathing left on the walls in years before are here tonight, on the stone that is slowly releasing the warmth that brought today's bathers here too. The furnaces have been running this building since before anyone alive remembers. The stoker who banked the fire tonight is not the first to do so. The hands that have maintained the fire in these furnaces through the seasons of many years, maintaining the heat that the bathers required, adjusting the fuel to the demand, banking the fire at closing, relighting it before dawn, have been different hands each generation. The specific knowledge of how this system ran, held in the minds and the muscle memory of people who are no longer alive. What one generation of stokers knew, they taught to the next. How much fuel each furnace required for different seasons. How to read the temperature of the floor above by the feel of the stone at the furnace mouth. How long before the bathing hours to light the fires so that the floor would be warm enough when the first bathers arrived. How long after the last bathers left before the fires could be banked. These judgments have been made in this building by different people for as long as the building has stood. The fires that heated the floor that the bathers walked on today were lit this morning by someone who learned from someone who learned from someone. The system they maintained is running tonight without them. The stone is releasing the heat they put into it. The water is cooling at the rate the pool's geometry and the stone's thermal mass determine. The condensation is following the paths that the wall's irregularities prescribe. None of this requires the stoker's knowledge. None of this requires the bather's presence. The building received what was given to it and is now returning it at the rate the materials allow. By dawn, the floor will be closer to the air temperature. The water will be cooler, still warmer than the air, because the water's thermal mass ensures it releases slowly but measurably closer to the temperature of the room than it was at midnight. The condensation on the walls will have run further down the plaster in the places where the wall remained cool enough through the night to keep receiving moisture, or will have stopped where the wall has warmed enough that the air in contact with it can hold what it holds. The building will be at a different state from its midnight state, closer to the outside temperature, most of the day's heat already released into the room's air. The room's air already exchanged through the night with the outside, through the gaps in the building structure. And then the stoker will arrive, and the furnaces will be lit, and the stone will begin to receive again. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. At midnight, the pool holds water that is still above the temperature of the air The surface of the water is exchanging with the air at the rate the current temperature difference and the current moisture content of the air allow. Molecules leaving the water surface. Molecules from the air arriving at the water surface. The net direction of the exchange still running from the water into the air. The water still releasing to what surrounds it. The floor beneath the pool is still warmer than the water. The stone that surrounds the pool on all sides is still warmer than the air of the room. The tile still conducting outward at the rate stone conducts, still delivering into the room the last portion of what the furnaces delivered into the stone this morning. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains.